Hi, Michelle. Thanks for joining me this evening, or this afternoon, I guess, in San Francisco, but this evening where you and I are, right, on the East Coast.
Yes.
So we're going to be talking this evening about payment transformation, the impact of COVID, the move towards real time, all kinds of good stuff happening. So why don't we just dive right in? If you want to just start off talking about what you're seeing as far as trends in business payments and how you've seen COVID impacting those trends.
Yeah, sure, Greg. Thank you, Greg, for the introduction, and Ginger for being here with us today. I think when we think about COVID, and the pandemic and the impact that it's had to all of our lives, the impact that first comes to mind is, certainly personal, because we all have been challenged by this. But obviously, there's been an incredible impact to our customers and businesses, really across the country in terms of the impact that it's had. When the shutdown really occurred in March, one of my favorite stories is that one of our customers said, I just took the check printer from our office because I didn't know when I was going to get to go back and how I was going to print checks. Or another one of my friends who's a CFO says, I sneak into the office on Sundays and sign checks that someone leaves for me when they're in the office on Saturdays. So it's certainly forced us to be creative in the way that we've handled everyday challenges. But when you think about all that we've done to migrate from paper to electronic processing, there still is an incredibly long way to go for many different businesses, small and large alike. And so I think some of the things that we've seen truly be impactful for our business customers is the first and foremost acknowledgement that, okay, what we were doing, multiple signatures on checks and printing them locally, is not going to be very effective in this type of environment that we're in. So companies have seen and tried to adopt ways to pay electronically where they no longer have to interact with individual sign forms. The challenge is if they haven't been capturing that ACH information or payment details, they have to put processes in place to be able to securely and accurately capture that information. And so we're starting to see, initially people were like, okay, we have to get rid of the checks. We need to start sending electronic payments, but they didn't have the processes or procedures in place in order to effectively do so. But I think as the pandemic has waned on, and hopefully will be resolving sooner than later, companies have been given the time to say, okay, let's thoughtfully look about how we can approach the move and make more payments electronically. We've also seen in the consumer space as well, the adoption, if you will, of options where they can push funds to cards or pay disbursements with Zelle from, educators to their students who are no longer there and they don't have any checking account information. They don't even maybe know where to find their checking account information. So there's been an impetus, if you will, of the rise of the social token to be able to capture information and send it, especially for in some of those industries where they had a number of people in their campuses on site, and now all of a sudden they were gone and they started to make payments to them. And so we have seen that trend, go in terms of making more payments electronic. We've also, interestingly enough, seen much more frequent payments with smaller dollar values. And so I think there's been some cash flow management practices and changes that companies have been implementing, that they're either paying their vendors more frequently, as a way that they want to do business with them, or paying their consumer customers more frequently if that's the nature of their business, or if they're individuals. We're seeing that payment rise in the cycling of the payments decrease in terms of the throughput and them making them. So it's been kind of interesting to see how businesses have really reacted and embraced some of the changing environment and landscape that we're in, and really starting to make what I think will be long-term impactful changes to their business.
And that was what I was going to ask. We're seeing a lot of changes on the consumer side as well, as how consumers are paying and businesses are doing largely the same. How much of it do you think is temporary? How much of it do you think those businesses are kind of putting in place these temporary procedures to manage through, like you said, going in on Sunday to sign checks that were left on Saturday? I love that story. How much of that do you think is going to stick? I mean, there's lots of discussion about never waste a good crisis, right? This is a great way for us to get over that hump to electronic. Yes. But do you think that businesses are really seeing the benefits, or are some of them, still really wedded to the way they've always done things?
I think that people are seeing the benefits and that the changes that they've made will certainly stick. It is very difficult to migrate all the way to an electronic payment, philosophy, if you will, for your business, and then all of a sudden say, okay, let's go back to writing checks from that perspective. And so I do think there'll be longevity in the changes. I think COVID could ultimately be what kills checks. We've been talking about it for as long as I've been in financial services, but it really hasn't happened. And some of you may recall that in 2018, we had a record check year from a business to business perspective, exactly the opposite of what people had thought. But I do think it will ultimately make those changes more permanent. But then also from a consumer perspective, we're seeing change. My grocery store, as an example, added contactless payment, so I can pay using my Apple Wallet. And so that piece of plastic and the transmission of it, handing it to someone, them swiping a machine, handing it back to you, and quote unquote, the germs that could be associated with that process, I think people are really starting to think, and be thoughtful about, what do I touch? What am I coming in contact with? And so I think, the rise of QR codes, which we have seen, and the increase in contactless payments will be trends that this will really, in this pandemic environment, give a boost to those problems and start to really make substantive changes to the adoption of them across the market.
It's a great point. A lot of stores are no longer accepting cash, or not accepting cash right now, because of that fear of touching things. And I guess I hadn't thought about the fact that for businesses, checks have the same problem, right? They're handed through several sets of hands on the paying side, and then they have to go to the receiving side. And if no one's in the office to receive them, then you have that whole mess to manage as well.
Yeah, and I know we're talking about payments, but we've seen a similar challenge on the invoice receipt process, and even on the receivables, where if you're getting checks through the lockbox, do you have to quarantine the checks for a number of time, and how do you process them? And so really, the physical nature of both invoices and checks and forms of payment have really started to get very much scrutinized to understand, do we really need to have it in that type of medium? And so I think the impact will continue across the entire financial supply chain, from invoicing to the payment, and ultimately the cash application as well.
Yeah, I suspect the need to quarantine the invoices and the checks, and the delay of payment that results in, is probably a big incentive to move to electronic to get things moving a little faster.
Absolutely.
So, as this is all happening, what is Wells doing to encourage that change? You guys were already kind of pushing it before this happened, obviously, in many ways, but what have you done to kind of accelerate what you're seeing happening with COVID and continue to encourage businesses to move that way?
I mean, it really starts with the customer and trying to meet them and their needs wherever they are going to be. And so one of the things that we did really early on in March, as the pandemic sort of, I think, took hold of our entire country, is look to say, okay, what options, what are the customers? What do they need? What are they hearing? And then how can we fulfill that need in a way that eliminates some of the requirements for paper and the processes that we had? So one of the things that we implemented very quickly was electronic signature capabilities, not necessarily outside of payment, but eliminating that need to share physical signatures of documents, really streamlined a lot of our upfront processes. And then from there, creating streamlined implementation capabilities for customers when they needed to quickly get online. And so, for example, disbursements with Zelle, we created, kind of an education toolkit where they could, use that to pay some of their students or the per diems that they had for maybe athletes that were still out and about and interacting in their sports. And so we did things to streamline it and make it as easy as possible, and to leverage what data they had available to them, and not necessarily ask them to say, okay, great, let's go out to all of your vendors and get their payment information. So recognizing the need for speed and simplicity, but also security, ensuring that we could make them as effective as possible as moving that process forward. But there were still a number of our customers that needed physical checks produced. And so, within their BCP processes, we became the BCP for some of our customers who had implemented it 10 years ago, but had never used it, so that we could print checks on their behalf. And then with respect to healthcare workers, we had a number of urgent requests for hospitals and labs to be able to get the ability to print checks, because they were just seeing such an influx of the volume that they had. They wanted to be more effective in producing it. And so, we really worked to kind of triage the most important cases that we had from a customer perspective and trying to implement them as quickly as possible and reducing any friction from the process. And friction is anything that really required exchange of information or a potential wet signature, whether it be a check block or a contract that somebody had to sign for a particular use case, eliminating all of those pain points that now became exacerbated by the fact that we couldn't be in person or exchanging documents real time, helping them move towards the electronic payment and recognizing that it was not one size fits all. Even some individual companies had multiple sets of their vendors that had different needs. And so really being able to apply our capabilities to their specific business challenge and use case to make them as effective as possible.
I have to say, Michelle, that having worked at a large regional bank for a number of years and knowing how difficult and painful it can be to implement any kind of changes on any products or offerings or processes, I'm very impressed with your ability to have made some changes during this time. And I think that probably speaks to, can you share a little bit about how that speaks to Wells' support for their customers during the pandemic?
Sure. Obviously our customers and their financial health as well as physical health is incredibly important to us. And we recognize that, while we have a duty to bring products to market in a very thoughtful and, risk adverse and really comprehensive way, we recognize in this environment that we had to balance the need for speed with our need for following our processes and internally. And so we actually stood up a COVID command center, which I'm sure many other companies that are out there listening to this had similar capabilities to really look at the ideas that we got either from our customers or from our teams that were hearing from their customers to say, we need X. And we would come up with a solution of, okay, here's how we can solve for that. But here are the steps in the process that we typically would take that we might need to circumvent. And so we created a streamlined product approval process to get things in the market as quickly as we could. And there were some we couldn't get over the finish line. So it's not that it was a completely foolproof exercise that we had, but there was a lot of great changes we could implement in a really short period of time to meet our customers' demands where they were.
Well, much like we hope the electronic payments continues post-COVID, I hope that change internally continues post-COVID for you and the other folks at Wells. It certainly will be helpful in product innovation. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about real time, which has been barreling along the last few years. Where is Wells on that path toward offering real time payments, and it kind of what are you seeing as the benefit to clients, and why or why not would they choose to use it?
Yeah, sure. So real time is currently one of the many faster payment options that Wells Fargo has in the market, spanning anywhere from, I consider same day ACH a faster payment option, as well as push to card and Zelle, as I mentioned earlier, and real time payments. And so we're in the market both sending and receiving real-time payments, the service offered through the clearinghouse, and implementing a number of customers on the capability. We really see, I think that the pandemic has certainly impacted the growth, if you will, and adoption from a real-time payments perspective, because just when they were starting to get, I would say, some traction in terms of banks signing on and being able to use in the market, we are hit with this global pandemic and everyone sort of all hands on deck to other problems and challenges, and implementing net new payment services for customers wasn't necessarily a priority when they're just trying to say, how do I get my payroll out, or how can I pay my vendors? And so I think that real-time payments, absolutely, the growth and the adoption has been impacted by the current environment that we have, but we're starting to see that open up, if you will, in terms of customers, that we have, looking to say, okay, what would this option look like for me, and how could we benefit? I think the ability to have payments 24/7 is incredibly powerful as you look to manage your cash flow, and the irrevocability of the payments that they can make certainly gives some finality to it, and you can use it as an alternative to other payment methods. Certainly much more cost effective than a wire, but has a lot of the same benefits to it. And so I think that, what we've seen from an adoption perspective, it's certainly the large fintechs that are really continue and usually do lead the way in terms of adoption, but we're also seeing, some other niche areas looking to adopt it, the daily pay kind of options. And so, for all the drivers that are now delivering food to all of our houses so we don't go out, the ability to pay them in an electronic fashion at the end of their workday is an incredibly powerful tool for those individuals. And we're also seeing the adoption kick up in a certain number of, consumer credit and access to cash really becomes one of the underlying themes of the use cases and adoption that we've seen is how do we allow customers and consumers, for that matter, get access to their cash as quickly as possible.
So as real-time payments are rolling out, and you've laid out a lot of great use cases for them, how far do you think the pendulum is going to swing? Will we ever see 100% real-time payments, or do you think they're just going to be one set of options in the arsenal of payment, possibilities that companies are looking at?
That's a great question, Ginger. And I think what we've seen is, since the beginning of time, when the first person wrote, an IOU on a rock, which was the early stages of checks, we went hundreds of years and only had 3 forms of payment: check, ACH, cash, and wire. And now within the past 3 years, we've implemented and doubled that number that's available to it. And so I'm pretty reticent to say that we will completely get rid of any of the old ones, even though I do think COVID will definitely have a tremendous impact on checks and their usage going forward. I also think that it's not a one-size-fits-all option. Because one, there are costs associated with the different payment types that are available, but there are also some items like irrevocability, dollar amount, ubiquity, and reach that really start to look at how customers want to adopt this. I think when FedNow, which is currently designing their own real-time payment systems, I think that will create some additional ubiquity that we haven't yet seen in the market. But I think we're going to be a couple years away from real-time payments, you're really starting to get to that hockey stick effect from an adoption perspective. I absolutely think that there's benefits to it. I think our customers see the benefits to it, and I think that it will be around for many years to come. We just have to get to a point where, it becomes much more prevalent in the market, not only from an adoption and an acceptance perspective, but also the ability to integrate and implement real-time payments. And so, for example, if your ERP system can't support it as a payment type, or you can only send batches to initiate payments, real-time payment really starts to lose its luster if you only send payment batches once a day, for an example. So it's really a balance between the market adoption, the technology to support it, and the business need to drive the use cases.
So we've only got a couple minutes left, Michelle, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. So why don't we try to do a couple of those? So one that I think is really interesting, you talked about how you guys have changed some of your processes for implementing so that you can kind of pivot on some of the things people needed during COVID. And so one of the audience members asked, what have you implemented quickly that you already know you're going to keep around for the long term?
I mentioned specifically some of the electronic signatures is something that, we were migrating to, and we just hit the gas in terms of the implementation to be able to get in place. Some of the streamlined implementation processes and what I will call building blocks that we built out for some of our payment options, push to card, disbursements with Zelle as examples. We created, I'll call them payments in a box for our customers to try to take out the noise from an implementation perspective and say, here's exactly what you want to implement. Here's the setup that you need to be most successful in this environment. And so really creating, the essentials of what they need for that particular payment type for them to be able to implement with quickly and without a lot of technology overhead, I think are going to be tenets of, some of how we look at products and launches going forward that we can leverage and replicate going forward into the future.
Great.
My risk partners would tell you that process won't stay in place and sort of trying to streamline some of those approvals. But I do think it created a very positive lens on simplicity and streamlining what we do for our customers to get them up to speed and implemented very quickly.
Which I think will only help you and your product offerings for your customers going forward, right? I think it's a win-win there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we only have about a minute left, so I'm just going to do one other question. There's been a couple of questions about the decline in checks and the decline in cash usage during the pandemic. Do you think the reluctance to use cash is going to, and the decline in checks, you think that's all going to persist post-pandemic? And think we're going to continue to see a decline there faster than we were seeing before?
It's going to be a convergence, if you will. Like, we have an incredible subset of the population that are still tied to their checks. So there's going to be a national evolution, as that population ages and, isn't making those payments any longer, that will create a natural decline. I think that a lot of us and a lot of our customers are seeing the challenges that paper checks and currency cause for their businesses, whether it's the cash vault driver and handling the different pieces of it, of the currencies. I think that those challenges were recognized and exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think where our customers have come up with longer term solutions to be able to handle some of those challenges, I don't see them going back to those more traditional method of check and cash, and they'll be leveraging the electronic going forward.
I hope that's true, because as you said, payments are always additive, right? We never take away any payment options. We just add new ones. And there's so many that it becomes almost hard for consumers and businesses to figure out what to use when and how to navigate all of it. So certainly kind of a move towards more electronic and away from cash and check is to the benefit of, I think, everyone in the ecosystem. Michelle, thank you for taking so much time to walk through this with me and with the Finovate audience. We've really enjoyed it. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Craig, back to you.